I'll admit I'm a little nervous. Sometimes when you're in the presence of like highly intelligent people, you start to you feel a little dumb. Thank you so much for that. Even though I know I'm also an intelligent person, and still you get that little bit of an ego trip, so thank you.
I think everybody here probably knows that Sarah runs pretty much the whole programming and the whole curriculum, and so it's a huge honor that you did the dialogue with me directly.
Thank you. Yeah, I really love being afraid, actually. Maybe it's because I'm a Pisces, maybe it's 'cause I'm a little emo. But I think that when we push ourselves to small micro doses of fear, which we call in permaculture the edge, we talk about that a lot, this is where we actually grow, and this is where we adapt, and this is where we learn to be resilient, and we realize what some of our limits are, as well as what some of our strengths are. So thank you for helping to cultivate that in myself.
On the topic, I have a really hard time actually focusing when there's ambient noise, so we will struggle with related things together.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. In our awkwardness, we present ourselves to you. So the title of this talk is an interesting one, and we'll see where we go. We have a lot of talking points, but we also wanted to just dialogue, because that really is so much of the gift of our humanity, is this ability to communicate, to abstract concepts, and to share in the moment, in the beautiful present moment. And the title of this talk was Thoughts on Psychological Orientation to a World in Meta-Crisis, right? We gave it this really heady title, right? And it is a very important topic when we think about our meta-crisis that we're having, but we can't even really fully understand what meta-crisis means until we define more and more of what's happening in the world. And what you were saying is we don't want to reduce things, right? I'm an herbalist, I'm a permaculture. It's reductionist thinking is useful, right? We see that as a tool. It's a tool of modern science and modern, philosophical beliefs. We also know how dangerous reductionism is. But we're holistic thinkers, right? We really see that there's this big picture out there, that everything is interconnected. Like I said, we aren't anything without all of you, and in many ways your experience isn't anything without us and all of you together. And so in that interconnection, thinking about meta-crisis, I feel like we do have to start to weed through and reduce a little bit in how we even create definitions for what things like meta means or what crisis means. And when I was reading about you, you're talking about you being a civilization designer, which is a heavy load to carry. And when we think about designing a civilization, I'm thinking of millennia of influence that we have in the world and that we're participating in the world. And so what does even civilization, if we can start to weed through that as we're creating the new world? Anyone out here use the new world paradigm in your vernacular? You can do a straight elbow. I know you do, right? So what does it mean to even think about civilization?
There's so many things that you said that I kind of want to address. I actually really rigorously avoid using terms like civilization designer. I'll say it's a
It was in your bio.
It says it's a topic I'm interested in.
Okay.
That's a distinction. I don't think anyone can do civilization design, but I think thinking through what viable civilizational structures would be is an important thing to do, while also recognizing the limits of our capacity to do it. I think so there's a problem with the term civilization. I'll speak to that, but first there's a problem with terms, right? As you were speaking about reductionism and words. So when Lao Tzu thought of what he would start the Tao Te Ching with, the first thing to say was the Tao that is speakable is not the eternal Tao. And I wrote a poem a few years ago called The Dance of the Tao and the 10,000 Things, and it asks, is an atom real? And then it's kinda an atom is real, the way we define it. And very pragmatically, we can do a lot of chemistry very reliably, but when we define the atom, we don't include in the definition of the atom the electromagnetic field without which it wouldn't exist, or the strong force without which it wouldn't exist, or the Higgs field without which it wouldn't exist, or the star that supernovaed to make it. So the atom definition takes for granted a whole universe of reality without which it wouldn't exist, right? And so this is true for every word. And so concepts are useful, and there is error embedded in every one, all the way down to error embedded in every word. And this is actually pretty critical to the meta crisis, because I think everybody here knows that both climate change is both a really big deal and carbon reductionism is a problem. It's possible to over-focus on how we reduce carbon in ways that under-focus on biodiversity and dead zones in oceans and nitrogen runoff and a lot of other things. But it's not just carbon, right? It's any metric. If we talk about number of trees planted, like the concept of a tree is a problem, because a 2,000-year-old tree and a 100-year-old tree and trees that have totally different genetics, like all of that's lost as soon as you make a concept that you can make a metric about, that you can do large-scale optimization of. But to do large scale, you can't include all the nuance. So inherent to being able to scale is the reduction of information, is the externalities associated. So when you think about the "thou shalt create no graven images and no false idols," the way I think about that is that models of reality are false idols if you take them to be reality. Right? Any model of human psychology, of how ecosystems work, of fundamental physics, has some utility to it, but is not true with a capital T. And to the degree that we get overexcited about it, make it true with a capital T, where the model of reality is different than reality, if we optimize for that model, is where we end up harming reality. So there needs to be some capacity to perceive reality not through the lens of what we already know as important, right? Immediate or non-mediated direct sensing of what's outside of conceptual frameworks.
Right, and when we talk about things like the error in the word, right, the word becomes the pure truth at some points. And what we do is with the word is we create an identity around that word, and then the framework of that identity loses its permeability, right? It's something like akin to a geopolitical border, like I'm Sarah, or you're Daniel, or this is Envision Festival, and we do see there's some type of a border, and we see my skin, and we see your skin, but what we know is that there's this huge energetic exchange, there's a microbiome flying all around us, there's electromagnetic fields, all these things, right, that's moving in between us. And so the word being so powerful, the word being spells that we're creating, that we become so stuck on, is actually so dangerous. And it's one of, I feel, our gifts of our human reality, is that we're able to do this, you know, and it's also our largest limitation.
Yeah, it's where you want to think about the models in terms of their usefulness. You want to run lots of different models that seem to emphasize different things, maybe even conflict with each other, and you want to hold them all with some lightness. And you want to hold, in terms of the no false idols, you want to hold your relationship to what is sacred as fundamentally unmodelable, unmeasurable, non-optimizable. So a corollary of the Tao that is speakable is not the eternal Tao, is the metric set that is optimizable is not the right metric set, which is the core issue with AI and AI alignment, which is now probably the fastest emerging issue that the world faces, is the issue of AGI alignment, generalized artificial intelligence, is it, if there's something that can optimize for a goal set very, very powerfully, very rapidly, so rapidly and powerfully that once it's doing that, we can't change it, is there any goal set that you can give it that is good? And it's a complex topic, but I would say simply the answer is no, right? There's no finitely describable, computable goal set that you would want to optimize infinitely, because, and we see this with the good measure of a life is GDP. Well, obviously GDP is not a good measure of reality because it can go up from war and addiction and sickness and lots of things like that. So then you say, well, GDP plus a Gini coefficient plus carbon, and that still doesn't include biodiversity. And so you add more metrics, there will always be some stuff that is in the real, particularly in the unknown set that is not in the metric set that is being optimized for. This is true for AI. It's also true for markets. It's also true for any kind of optimization process. So I don't want to infinitely optimize any finitely described thing, which is why we want some relationship to reality that is outside of description. And ultimately the sacred is bound to a direct sensing that is trans-semiotic, not reducible to symbol.
Outside of description, I have the image comes in of looking through the eyes of a child, you know, and how that little one is constantly asking why, and why, but why, but why. And if you've ever experienced that with young ones or even of ourselves, you know, we stop asking, we want to ask why, and then we feel we have to keep finding the answers, find the answer, find the answer. But when they're the little ones and they keep taking us down that hole, they challenge us to remember that we can't actually know everything right there. And so to attempt to create metrics for everything is kind of pushing beyond maybe what is the sacred mystery of our reality, you know, and trying to metric everything and optimizing everything is inherently an exploitive capitalistic model, right? Which is going in many ways, which comes into the reality of the known civilization that we're living in right now, and that everything has some type of value that needs to be exploited in some way. There's a value-added product in every single ecosystem or within every single person that we see, and so we gotta optimize that, make it the best, pull it out of them, put them into a leadership conference again and again, right? Get more life coaches to tell them that they're, you know, how they can optimize themselves, or like the whole concept of biohacking and all these things, you know. So when I think about that, what also comes up for me is in our permaculture philosophies, the ethic of fair share was originally taught as setting limits yields abundance. And as we were talking earlier about that, we're like, that, how does that scale, and how does that interact with our human impulse control, which you were all talking about in the previous conversation? What do you got to say about that?
How you make something healthy and how you make it scale are usually at conflict with each other. To be able to make something scale, like in a small scale context, everyone who's involved can be involved in the decision making. Consensus obviously does not scale in the same way. Being able to talk about all the nuance and the difference between this exact tree and this other tree, you can't do that at scale, and so you reduce things to metrics. You apply technology that optimizes for some things at the expense of other things. So this is where I think a lot of the focus on small scale is both valuable and misguided, because it won't address the problems of large scale unless it understands why it doesn't scale. And if it wants to actually deal with the biosphere, it's like, there's a stat, something to the effect of China poured as much concrete in the last 2 years as the US poured in the entire 20th century. That's a huge thing to understand, and there is no such thing as addressing climate change or addressing the health of the oceans at a country level, right? Let alone at a local eco-community level. And so I think it's important if someone is trying to think about, is a smaller scale, higher touch solution to some of the problems they see in the world, is it a solution that can address issues at scale in time or not, and just at least be realistic about that? One thing I was thinking is, you just said inherent to that kind of reductionism is implicit in capitalism. It is, but it's not unique to capitalism. Like communism metrified things and tried to optimize metric sets. Capitalism is just the most effective system. But in a world where to fill defense budgets we do a bunch of quantitative easing, it's hard to even call that capitalism in the same way, right? It's not a market function, and you subsidize radically. all the problems of the world, or many of them, can happen even with good intent. This is a thing that I would like to address, is it's fundamentally easier to solve a problem than it is to ensure that your solution to that problem doesn't cause other problems. It's easier in kind, not just motivationally, but epistemologically, thought-wise. Because if I'm defining my problem, like, whatever it is, I want to bring CO2 down, or I want to help the topsoil in this area, or I want to help economic development for these people, the solution I'm going to create will be a technology, a company, a law that is trying to directly solve that problem as defined. And so I'm trying to create a first order effect on a small number of known measures, right? CO2, or the GDP per capita of these poor people, or the whatever it is. But because whatever I create is going to interact with social systems and ecologies and economies that are complex, it's going to have effect on other things. It's going to have second, third, fourth order effects on a lot of unknown things. So to try to prevent the harm from a particular activity requires nth order calculation on a very large unknown set of things. Whereas to just build the thing is first order effects on a small number of things. So there's an asymmetry. It's radically easier to solve narrowly defined problems than to define the problem well enough and come up with a solution that doesn't do that. There's also an asymmetry in the game theory, that those who focus on the opportunity more and the risk less get first mover advantage and get capital and get power, and then when the problems happen, they say we couldn't have known and socialize the losses. The people who are focused on maybe we should slow down with AI or with synthetic bio or whatever it is, if they can't slow everyone else down and they're more authentically focused on risk, they just lose the capital opportunities, lose first mover advantage, and still don't address the thing. So it is important to understand that you have these asymmetries independent of problematic intention.
It's interesting thinking about intention, and specifically what you were bringing up is measurable actions and reactions, and inherently we're talking about our social systems and our relationships, right, with each other, with the world, with our concepts of fairness and justice, our concepts of divinity, these types of things, and what are the effects of these belief systems, of these actions, and trying to quantify them and all these things, and how good intent, we create different types of, it was a word that our friend Alnor the other day in his talk used, it is we create alibis for our good intent, which I thought was really a profound thing to acknowledge. And in our good intent, and starting on the scales that feel attainable to us, because you're such a macro thinker, but for many of us in audience, it's really difficult to see things from the macro scale, because we're so wrapped up in our own worlds sometimes that, like, looking outside of ourselves, it's like so heavy, or if we start to inform ourselves about what's happening to other people around the world, it's devastating on the soul level. When we look at situations like in Iran, for example, that's what feels most passionate to me right now, is the female movement there that's happening. And I feel powerless to it. But where I do feel powerful is in situations like this. Where I feel powerful is in those micro attempts at creating fairness and justice within communal systems. And so when we're looking, say, at community, we talk about things like consensus, and it's hard. It's really hard. It's hours and hours and hours and hours and days and days and days of processing to finally say that we all agree on if it should be pizza or pasta, right? Like the simple things we'll sit there and debate about as human beings, because our consensus is so often rooted in personal opinion, is that how do we then, if we can't scale consensus, what we're inherently seeing is that what is scalable are things that are punitive in nature, like punishable, by nature, and that so then we're operating in fear-based systems that are saying if we don't do something based on this governance structure that says this is how it's supposed to be, we're going to be harmed physically, mentally, emotionally, financially, in our resources, et cetera, et cetera. So, like what is, how do we make sense? This is some of the suggestions from a mutual friend who was telling me about you. She's like, ask him how to make sense of things, right? Because it's really easy to keep talking about like the grand, the big scary picture of it all and the devastation of it all. And so how do we make sense of these small scale systems in relationship to power over systems that are like boulders and we're ants against it?
How do we make sense? How do we increase our agency to be able to affect things that are devastating if we feel, and if we don't feel like we have any agency, we kind of can't stay with? What was this? There was one more part of it.
It's talking about scaling. If consensus doesn't work, what seems to work are power over systems of governance that are inherently punitive in their nature.
One first part about how to make better sense of things is seek the most well-informed contradictory perspectives to the ones you currently hold and really study them.
That I love, breaking apart your echo chamber. If you're always reading news that validates your belief systems, you're not growing and you're not evolving.
Well, so this is one of the things about the devastation is there's a lot of, it's a very natural process to seek security through certainty and to be really uncomfortable with things that are maybe catastrophically critical to the world where your best answer is I have no fucking idea. That's actually hard, right? It's hard to sit and I have no fucking idea to something that really matters and I should know how to orient to, and to feel certain about it and to feel like I know what team to side with. Like, not only is that a very easy emotion and process to empathize with, it's an easy one for all competing power systems to exploit in people.
Well, because when we put each other into teams, we're inherently becoming hyper-competitive, right? Instead of, because we're creating that identity that doesn't have a permeability to it, right? And that this is just it, and like this is the truth right here. Whereas when we look into the forest ecosystems, or we look to animals, they're territorial in nature, and those territories are in their nature fluid, right? And so that right there starts to break that apart if we stop seeing each other as teams, and that we start to see each other more as interconnected, collaborative partners that sometimes swap around, that we have very polycultural relationships with each other.
Yeah, and as you already acknowledged, even friends living together in a eco-village might take 3 days to come to see each other as collaborators and not enemies when it comes to really trivial seeming shit that their ego gets stuck on, which has nothing to do with like Israel-Palestine or great power plays or things like that. So the actual practice of seeing who is easiest to otherize, villainize, and really seek to understand their perspective in a non-pejorative way is a hard practice. It's a necessary practice. The better you are at it, the better you can be at actually influencing non-conflict solutions or higher order solutions to lots of things. So one thing I'd say is your current best understanding of most anything, how to deal with climate change, species extinction, fake news, whatever, is orders of magnitude insufficient for what the right answer actually is. To acknowledge that means to step into really radical uncertainty about something you care about. It's easier to be like, I don't know, that's not my topic, and bail, or to feel some certainty, or to at least find someone else that seems smart, has certainty, and you can align with. And none of those are adequate, right? Because the really smart person that has certainty totally gets into fights with someone else who's as smart, who has certainty about conflicting things. And sometimes they just don't have the epistemic flexibility to see it another way because they spent their whole career working on one strategy. Sometimes they have deep investments in that, right?
And it goes into false idols, right? And elevating people into these positions where that's what I believe, and I'm going to hold them to that,
Well,
no matter what they
sometimes
say.
it's false idols. It's also just cognitive offloading, right? When there's huge complexity and when it's hard to make sense of the world, it becomes easier to want to default to somebody else's thinking. And it's actually true that we cannot make sense of the total complexity of all the things, which is why we have a model of institutions that are supposed to be trustworthy authorities to do that. The challenge is that the moment an institution, whether it was a church or a scientific institution, has the perceived legitimate authority on what is true, there's a lot of power to being the legitimate authority on what's true, so power starts seeking to influence that. Which is why there are very few institutions that the whole world currently in extreme partisan divide accept as true, and that's actually fair. It's not just crazy people on the right, it's that there is massive institutional bias. So the thing I want to bring up is that there's an adaptive valley between where you currently are and where you could be effective that is really uncomfortable. And it feels like tuning your attention to things you care about that you don't think you can do anything about, and feeling the devastation of that without an answer. Because if you can be aware of what's happening in Iran or factory farms or Turkey or Haiti, and then just totally go back to just being focused on living your best life ever and killing it and not being bothered by that, like there's something wrong with you. To not be at all devastated in a world where there's so fucking much devastation means a kind of sociopathic level of dissociation.
Exactly. And what we were talking about in our conversation earlier is despair, and how the power over and the realities of the world and the powerlessness and our lack of agency in our lives leads us to really deep despair, which then eventually and parallelly, right, brings us also into really deep-rooted states of apathy. And for me, the greatest soul sickness that we share as human beings in the world right now is apathy, is that we don't care enough about what's happening to the other. And if we are all connected to the world soul, and we are all connected to each other in every single way possible, if you're suffering, I am suffering, no matter what. And it doesn't matter how much I do if others are suffering out of proportion to those of us that are thriving. It's going to keep causing that despair and that apathy and that harm, right? We don't care enough in the world. And so how do we make sense of that?
Yeah, so when you were saying that you think about the issue women are facing in Iran, it's devastating, but you don't know what you can do about it. If you tried to understand the issue continuously for a few months, you would be able to do shit about it.
But I have been thinking about it for months, and I don't feel like I have shit I can do about it.
So
that's the thing. Like seeing 12-year-old girls being
Yeah.
beat up in the street for trying to walk alone, I don't feel like I can do anything about it.
instantly you can't, right? You can see that video and feel devastated. You can't do anything instantly. But if you actually have the ability to reach out to people who are on the ground and get more intel from them. That is an upside of technological capability. You have an ability to start to then identify who are people that have more levers of power there. And like in your network here, there are people who know the US ambassador and the UN ambassador to Iran. You could totally get them in a medicine ceremony. You could totally actually have a deep conversation and start to figure out pathways of influence. But it does take feeling those feelings, not knowing what to do about them, and then seeking to understand shit that you don't normally try to understand, like who has political power in the situation. So it's actually, this is the important thing, is that one has to lean into feeling the devastation and stay there, and lean into not knowing the answer and stay there as the training to then get the capabilities to start to have progressively more competent answers.
It's like those moments when you lean in to stay there, right? It's the moment where you feel the most uncomfortable in it, whether it's in whatever routine or practice you have, or even we were talking about the effects of the phone. You know, it's like even setting that aside, and you get like that twitch of I want to look, what's happening. You know, or the moments when you're in the forest and being silent and sitting, and you feel uncomfortable with the life that's around you and all the things that you feel like you have to do that are important in your world. And then when you really start to sit there is when, and ease and lean into the uncomfortableness is when you start to see all the life around you. I just got really loud. You start to see all that life around you, and you start to feel so deeply interconnected with it all, and seeing that your life in some ways is everything and nothing at once.
Yeah, so you were mentioning the relationship between despair and apathy, and despair is way better than apathy. Apathy is an escape from pain that you don't feel like you can deal with through agency, right? So if I'm feeling despair, it's because something I care about is being harmed, and I'm feeling that. But underneath it, the source of it is care, right? If I didn't love or care about, if you didn't love those women, if you didn't care about if you didn't find something sacred and beautiful about their life, you wouldn't give any shits about it, right? So the despair is actually an expression of what you find beautiful, meaningful, sacred, and that you love. It's what the fear is about too, right? The fear and anxiety is about that things that you find sacred will be harmed. The anger is also about the same thing. It's that something that you find sacred, beautiful, meaningful is being harmed, and you're looking at who's doing it. So if you trace all those emotions back to their source, is what is actually sacred to me that I want to be in service to? And then you realize if the despair shuts my agency down, it's actually not an ethical thing I can indulge. Because this love actually requires me to be as effective as I can be. And so I find that there's a transformation. If I take what I'm afraid of and I trace it back to what is it that I care about that I don't want to have be harmed, and I really tune into the sacredness there, and then I say, how can I be most in service? I get something that's more like careful than fearful. The anger turns into like impassioned action. The despair turns into both grief and awe and motivation. And the apathy is actually, even we can empathize with it in ourselves and others, it's an overwhelm at pain that we don't know how to deal with. But the answer is actually more figuring out how to have agency more so we can stay with the feelings rather than turn them off.
And I feel like some of the agency is actually the choice in how we work with our feelings and how we let them sometimes cause ourselves harm, cause others harm based on how we feel. And so that first step in agency is acknowledging the feelings that we're having, processing through them. And what also comes up for me, which was such a profound moment in my reality, coming from like that Catholic wounding, which I bet a lot of you have out there, right? And acknowledging things like witch wound and stepping into, personal power, embodied power and agency, was realizing that holy places aren't places with identities, and they aren't places that are held by the few, but it's actually in every single step we take. And that the holy ground is right beneath your feet right now, everywhere that we're moving through the world. And in that holy of the ground and that holy step, it's reminding us that that is sacred to me and that everything in life is sacred to me. So it's like, if we can come into that place, and this is what I love so much about modern witchcraft, and that movement is exactly that, because it's the decentralization specifically of power in relationship to what is divine and what is sacred and what is holy.
Yeah, I really like this. We were saying earlier that with all of the, not just risks of what will happen, but the active, tragic things that are happening currently, if someone doesn't feel regular heartbreak, there's something wrong, right? And if someone doesn't feel regular awe at the sacred, there's something wrong, because both are always parts of reality, right?
One of my favorite quotes is by Joanna Macy. I keep it on my altar. And it says, "The heart that breaks open can contain the entire universe." And so I feel like the more and more and more we allow ourselves to move into that suffering and through that despair and into that like deep well of sadness for the world and grieving for the world, it's a lot of her work as well, the more and more we can cultivate that care and that empathy and that and unconditional love for life, right? That's the philosophical core of biophilia.
When you were talking about that there's an uncomfort when you're sitting in the jungle, I was thinking of medicine journeys, whether it's with medicine or it's a vision quest and there's almost none of them that are meaningful that don't involve moving through intense discomfort, right? And being able to there's something about intense discomfort that is associated with the expansion of the capacity of a being. And so one can take their emotional response to the state of the world as a medicine and hold that whole thing as a sacred path to be like, okay, I want to lean into it to grow where I can both love more and respond to the love more effectively. And whatever difficult ayahuasca journey is required of me to do that, that's what I'm here to do.
We're coming to time. Wow. I love this so much. I think we perhaps, we only really have 5 minutes left. Time flies and it crawls all at the same time. Daniel, I'm so honored to have this conversation with you and to sit here and for you to share with us and for you to, bring your gifts to Envision. And thank you so much for your humility and your kindness and your openness and your flexibility and your brilliance. Thank you for the work that you do in the world.
Thank you for making this space. It's beautiful. And inviting me.
You're welcome. You're so welcome. Any final, perhaps, thoughts that you want to leave our audience with as we move into closing out this event, as we move into our final night, as people break through this one reality into all the other spectrums of reality that we exist on, as we go out into the world? What do you want to leave us with?
If you're feeling right now, you might not be, but if you're feeling any sense of increased seriousness, but also increased sacredness, increased desire that the thoughts, words, and deeds that you engage with matter more to life, tattoo it on your hand. Or any time after a journey that you feel that sense of increased meaningfulness, fucking figure out how to remind yourself of that all the time. Because we're distractible beings. And we can get way more absorbed and pissed off at the person that did some minor wrong to us in a business transaction than at warlords killing lots of people. Because we're just too fucking tiny in our focus. We just get distracted. So you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time around. There's truth to that. Consciously change who you're around to align with the thoughts you want to be thinking about, the things you want in your awareness to cultivate who you are. Consciously change the information streams coming in, because the most amazing Satori state shifts people have don't mean shit for their life a couple years later, because you just forget it and go back to the other stuff. The things that usually end up mattering, those states matter only insofar as it translates to changes in the continuous input. So figure out how to do something in this moment that will remind you to change the continuous input that aligns your life moment to moment with what matters most to you more.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Thank you, everybody.